Harry Potter has been analyzed to death. You might be asking yourself, what could possibly be new in a video posted 3 decades after the first book was published? And why did I click on it? If you're like me, and you spent your whole childhood staying up late reading the books by flashlight, watching the movies, playing some of the video games, or maybe even the trading card game, there are still plenty of mysteries and bits of lore that you probably missed. Secrets that I have compiled into today's Iceberg. There are literally hundreds of topics I could add to this list, so this might be an ongoing series. Who knows? For now, all aboard the Hogwarts Express. We're going to enter some strange wizarding territory. If you don't know how an iceberg works, I don't know where you've been, but I'll explain anyway. I'm going to start at some of the more normal, perhaps even somewhat commonly known elements of the Harry Potter universe, but pretty quickly it's going to move down into deeper levels where, unless you're living and breathing this stuff, you probably haven't heard about it. And we're going to start with one of my new favorite topics. Mandrakes are super messed up. I'm honestly going to work on another video, either deep diving mandrakes or on the broader topic of all the traumatic parts of Harry Potter, but until then, this will have to do. Mandrakes, in case you don't remember, are introduced to us in the Chamber of Secrets as a plant that can rouse petrified students from their basilisk-induced slumber. Using a mandrake plant, a witch or wizard can prepare a mandrake restorative draught. "We will be able to cure her, Argus," said Dumbledore patiently. "Professor Sprout recently managed to procure some mandrakes. As soon as they have reached their full size, I will have a potion made that will revive Mrs. Norris." "I'll make it," Lockhart butted in. "I must have done it 100 times. I could whip up a mandrake restorative draught in my sleep." Only, in case you've forgotten, mandrakes are a little more than that houseplant that you've neglected to water. Pause the video and go water it right now, I promise. I'll still be here. They are, by all accounts, basically plant people that are routinely grown and harvested. You don't have to take my word for it. This is how we're introduced to them in the Chamber of Secrets, a book that was, remember, written for children. Harry snapped the earmuffs over his ears. They shut out the sound completely. Professor Sprout put the pink, fluffy pair over her own ears, rolled up the sleeves of her robes, grasped one of the tufty plants firmly, and pulled hard. Harry let out a gasp of surprise that no one could hear. Instead of roots, a small, muddy, and extremely ugly baby popped out of the earth. The leaves were growing right out of his head. He had pale green, mottled skin and was clearly bawling at the top of his lungs. I mean, come on, we're not even pretending that they aren't just pretty much human beings. They start as babies, they grow up, go through teenage years, and as described by Madame Pomfrey was pleased to report that the mandrakes were becoming moody and secretive, meaning that they were fast leaving childhood. The moment their acne clears up, they'll be ready for repotting again. Harry heard her telling Filch kindly one afternoon, and after that, it won't be long until we're cutting them up and stewing them. And then, of course, Professor Sprout mentions that the moment they start trying to move into each other's pots, we'll know they're fully mature. Which, when I was younger, I thought implied that the mandrakes were trying to propagate. But in hindsight, I'm wondering if she's literally just meant the equivalent of plant marriage and like moving in together, settling down, working on your plant career, starting your plant family. And instead of allowing that to happen, wizards pluck them from their homes, cut them up, and boil them. Now, I know you might be thinking, it's the same as cows and chickens and any other animal, and I might agree with you if not for the fact that they are pretty much just humans that happen to have leaves instead of hair. They start as babies, grow into teenagers, start throwing house parties or pot parties, and then they move in together. Sometimes I have to stretch the topics I'm talking about, but the quotes are doing all the work for me this time. I will also note that the Fantastic Beasts companion book mentions that mandrake growers have been known to seize the leaves of one of their prized plants only to find a bloody, mangled mess below, owing to the attention of a dugbug. So try as you may to spin this as them being plants, they have seemingly normal-ish blood that's pumping through their phloem and xylem, I guess. One other moment to mention. In the Deathly Hallows, during the final climactic battle for Hogwarts, Neville rushes past Harry carrying some large pots. He was roused by Professor Sprout, who was thundering past, followed by Neville and half a dozen others, all of them wearing earmuffs and carrying what appeared to be large potted plants. Mandrakes, Neville bellowed at Harry over his shoulder as he ran. Going to lob them over the walls. They won't like this. A couple points. First, I hadn't mentioned it, but as Hermione correctly answers Sprout in Book 2, the cry of a mandrake is fatal to anyone who hears it. So, what exactly does Neville think is the outcome of throwing mandrakes at the assaulting Death Eaters? At a certain point, they should just start casting Avada Kedavra. Whether you kill them with a mandrake catapult or an instant kill curse, what's the difference? Avada Kedavra honestly almost seems like a better way to go, better than being screamed to death by a living plant. This is also a pretty rough way to die as a mandrake, getting thrown to your death over a castle wall. Basically used as cannon fodder, and from the Death Eater's side, is everyone in the Wizarding Universe knowledgeable enough to shield themselves against a mandrake? Like, how well do you have to hear the mandrake's cry for it to be fatal? Is there a zone where you can hear and have enough time to cast like a earmuff spell? Or is it just a screaming pot of instant death that comes flying towards you from the castle walls? Because that's actually a terrifying concept to consider. But enough about mandrakes, we have to spread our roots. There's so much more ground to cover. Walkie-talkie Patronus. On to a secret that's been hidden in plain sight. Now, listen, I have made quite a bit of content about Harry Potter, and believe it or not, that means reading quite a bit of the source material again. I'm not going to pretend to be the most knowledgeable on the topic, but I definitely know a fair amount. But sometimes something just slips right by you, like the fact that all the Order of the Phoenix members communicate via messenger patronuses. I've had a feeling that not many people caught this prior to Book 7 because it happens like 6 times in the span of 2 chapters in Deathly Hallows. For example, they all saw it at the same time, a streak of light that came flying across the yard and onto the table, where it resolved itself into a bright silver weasel, which stood on its hind legs and spoke with Mr. Weasley's voice. And then it happens a few times later in the book when McGonagall casts 3 Patronuses simultaneously, each carrying a messages. Come, we must alert the other heads of house. You'd better put that cloak back on. She marched toward the door, and as she did so, she raised her wand. From the tip burst 3 silver cats with spectacle markings around their eyes. The Patronuses ran sleekly ahead, filling the spiral staircase with silvery light, as Professor McGonagall, Harry, and Luna hurried back down. Along the corridors they raced, and one by one the Patronuses left them. A couple things. Am I the only one that this felt weird to? Like, they invented this very specific spell for doing a very specific job, repelling Dementors, and then Dumbledore, or I guess J.K. Rowling, decided it serves a completely different job now. I mean, I can't change anything. It just feels strangely coincidental and Deus Machina-y. It's a clever way for the recipient to identify who's sending the messages, because the Patronus is absolutely linked to that person, but it feels a little wrong to me. Like, what if Alohomora unlocked doors in Book 1, but suddenly in Book 4 it could, like, unlock your thoughts? Or if Wingardium Leviosa could lift objects and also lift your spirits? Both of those feel like stretches for a spell that has another use that's being repurposed for reasons. Anyways, regardless of my thoughts on it, I stumbled across this little fun fact while I was reading some early interviews with J.K. Rowling, in which she mentions that readers had actually seen this method of communication long before Deathly Hallows. The mention in question happens to be a single sentence in Goblet of Fire. Harry and Dumbledore hurried forward. Krum was sprawled on the forest floor. He seemed to be unconscious. There was no sign at all of Mr. Crouch. Dumbledore bent over Krum and gently lifted one of his eyelids. Stunned, he said softly. His half-moon glasses glittered in the wand light as he peered around at the surrounding trees. "Should I go and get someone?" said Harry. "Madame Pomfrey?" "No," said Dumbledore swiftly. "Stay here." He raised his wand into the air and pointed it in the direction of Hagrid's cabin. Harry saw something silvery dart out of it and streak away through the trees like a ghostly bird. I mean, frankly, I have no idea how anyone would have put two and two together in Goblet of Fire that this was happening. Harry does clarify this is what happened in Half-Blood Prince, but still, I'm not surprised J.K. Rowling included it so often in Book 7 because clearly not many readers picked up on it. Or maybe I'm just projecting. Either way, not my favorite spell usage, but let me know your thoughts. Basilisks are actually pretty common. You all remember that monster in the Chamber of Secrets, right? The enormous snake that can kill you just by making eye contact? Something that is basically out of a nightmare or Greek mythology? The one that's supposedly no one's seen for a super long time? Yeah, that one. Well, it turns out that not only are they probably somewhat common, they're also incredibly easy to breed. I mean, that part at least comes straight from Chamber of Secrets. Of the many fearsome beasts and monsters that roam our land, there is none more curious or more deadly than the basilisk. Known also as the King of Serpents, this snake, which may reach gigantic size and live many hundreds of years, is born from a chicken's egg hatched beneath a toad. Its methods of killing are most wondrous, for aside from its deadly and venomous fangs, the basilisk has a murderous stare, and all who are fixed with the beam of its eye shall suffer instant death. Spiders flee before the basilisk, for it's their mortal enemy, and the basilisk flees only from the crowing of the rooster, which is fatal to it. But as you can imagine, if something is both super easy to do and also illegal, you can pretty much guarantee there's going to be a black market for it, despite whatever the wizard government might tell you. The creation of basilisks has been illegal since medieval times, although the practice is easily concealed by simply removing the chicken egg from beneath the toad when the Department of Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures comes to call. However, since basilisks are uncontrollable except by Parselmouths, they are as dangerous to most dark wizards as to anybody else, and there have been no recorded sightings of basilisks in Britain for at least 400 years. They say that no basilisk has been seen for 400 years, but just one sentence earlier, it's mentioned that the practice of creating a basilisk is extremely easy to conceal. Maybe it feels like a bit of a plot hole to me, but something like putting a toad on a chicken egg is so easy. I'm surprised there aren't basilisks slithering around everywhere, let alone not being seen for 400 years. I mean, think about it. We have to stop children from doing stupid things all the time. I can pretty easily imagine a group of kids doing a little experiment, especially if they lived out on a farm. Chicken eggs and toads would both be readily available. The Fantastic Beasts book claims that because basilisks can only be controlled by a Parseltongue, that they're therefore as dangerous to dark wizards as normal wizards, expecting that to limit their breeding. But it seems to ignore that a basilisk breeder could just put it in a box. My only explanation for all this is that when J.K. Rowling wrote Chamber of Secrets, it was written primarily for children. Spoiler. And so she added a sort of whimsical breeding method. Her magical world wasn't quite as fleshed out yet, and I'd wager that if the basilisk had come in a later book, the method of their creation would either be much more complicated or just omitted entirely, saving herself this awkward mix of extremely dangerous and incredibly easy to obtain. Of course, there are plenty of other topics to talk about with the basilisk, but we'll get to those later. Potter Island. One piece of a series like Harry Potter that I always find fascinating are the parts that never came to be. Plot lines that were changed, characters that were removed, or in some instances, entire character origin stories that were thrown out. Take, for instance, our main character, none other than Harry Potter himself. Now that there are 7 books, 8 movies, 3 spin-off movies, a play, and of course a trading card game, did anyone else play this game besides me? Am I just the only one that did this? I specifically remember having this set of 3 cards, Pureblood, Sherbert Lemon, and Wattlebird, and if you had one, you could place it upside down and your opponent had to guess one of those 3 phrases. If they got it wrong, they'd take damage, whatever. I had only one of those 3 cards, and it went through the washer, so there was damage to it, and so it was pretty obvious every time I played it that it was Sherbert Lemon. So it was not a super effective card for me. I hope I'm not the only one that played this game. I'm way off topic, but speaking of this backstory, you think we would know Harry's origin story, right? It's pivotal to basically the entire plotline, so you'd think it would be pretty set in stone. Philosopher's Stone, that is. Except in early drafts of the first book, things go down very, very differently. The very, very earliest drafts of the first chapter of Philosopher's Stone have the Potters living on a remote island, Hermione's family living on the mainland, her father spotting something that resembles an explosion out at sea and sailing out in a storm to find their bodies in the ruins of their house. I can't remember now why I thought this was a good idea, but I clearly recognized that it wasn't very early on, because the Potters were relocated to Godric's Hollow for all subsequent drafts. Now, obviously we can't take this too seriously, as J.K. Rowling pretty clearly moved on from this origin story for the Potters pretty early, but when I read things like this, I can't help but wonder if they were absorbed into other parts of the story. For instance, I wonder if the idea for a remote home in the middle of the sea was somehow translated into the Dursleys' shack. It was very cold outside the car. Uncle Vernon was pointing at what looked like a large rock way out at sea. Perched on top of the rock was the most miserable little shack you could imagine. There's also a rickety old sailor dude that rows them out into the middle of the sea on a dark, stormy night. It's altogether ridiculous, especially when compared to the later books. It's funny how, as the series went on, it became much less whimsical. I don't only mean from a light, dark perspective. Harry also has to grow up and fight a crazy person after all. I mean the actual world around Harry. Philosopher's Stone starts with imaginative set pieces and fresh new magical ideas, chocolate frogs and moving photographs, and that all kind of disappears after a few books. This shack on a rock is one minor microcosm of this. You can't, for example, imagine this trip out to a shack on a rock happening in book 5, 6, or 7 because they've all been Batman Dark Knight-ified. Everything becomes darker and grittier despite living in a world where even your chess games are more fun. So while this was originally a point about the way Harry's family started their journey on a remote island with a giant explosion in the night, something that is still distinct from the Dursley shack, it feels like that's where the series went anyways. Somewhere out on a remote island cut off from the magical world that birthed it. This is another area I want to explore a little deeper in a different video, but I'm getting a little too poetic for an iceberg, so on to the next topic. Horcruxes make the man. To close out level 1, I've got a topic that might be a little more of a misconception or misunderstood portion of the series. It has to do with Voldemort's appearance. There is little as iconic as Ralph Fiennes' depiction of Voldemort throughout the series. It's one of the things that actually has me worried that the HBO reboot is going to ruin things when that role gets recast. But that's for another video. Also, I found out that I've been pronouncing Ralph Fiennes' name wrong this whole time. No, not like Ralph, not a moron, but it's not Ray. It's not Ray Fiennes, it's Rafe Fiennes. There's like 2 F's in there. Anyway, I think there's this misconception out there that Voldemort looks the way he does because of his rebirth in Goblet of Fire. The Thin Man stepped out of the cauldron, staring at Harry, and Harry stared back into the face that had haunted his nightmares for 3 years. Whiter than a skull, with wide, livid scarlet eyes, and a nose that was flat as a snake's with slits for nostrils. Lord Voldemort had risen again. Voldemort looked away from Harry and began examining his own body. His hands were like large, pale spiders. His long white fingers caressed his own chest, his arms, his face. The red eyes, whose pupils were slits like a cat's, gleamed more brightly through the darkness. I'm sure that whatever Wormtail had to do to resurrect him certainly had an effect on how he looked, but I think the less talked about factor here is that not only do Horcruxes change the soul, they also physically alter the person. Long before Voldemort was killed the first time around, his appearance had begun to change, and we can base that on the interaction we see between Dumbledore and Tom Riddle in The Half-Blood Prince. This is a memory of Dumbledore's that he and Harry have jumped into via the pensive. Harry let out a hastily stifled gasp. Voldemort had entered the room. His features were not those Harry had seen emerge from the Great Stone Cauldron almost 2 years ago. They were not as snake-like. The eyes were not yet scarlet, the face not yet mask-like, and yet he was no longer handsome Tom Riddle. It was as though his features had been burned and blurred. They were waxy and oddly distorted, and the whites of his eyes now had a permanently bloody look, though the pupils were not yet the slits that Harry knew they would become. So he's clearly different when he comes out of the cauldron, but it's not totally just the cauldron's fault for the changes in his appearance. Despite it being totally possible that the unborn fetus, or whatever it was that Wormtail dropped into the cauldron, being the basis for Voldemort's deformed body, it seems like it has more to do with the individual's soul, or lack thereof in Voldemort's case, that gives him his good looks. I'm pretty sure, though I'm happy to get feedback here, that the implication is he's becoming more snake-like because it's biblical ties to the devil. But I guess it does raise the question of what the end of the spectrum looks like. As in, sure, Voldemort has split his soul 7 times, but what if he did it more? Would eventually he just turn into a literal snake or some sort of demon? Who's to say? But we don't have time. We have so much more ground to cover and 4 more levels to get to. As we move into level 2, I tried to section off tidbits that were slightly less common knowledge. You were probably aware of at least a few in level 1, but as we work our way further and further down, I'm hoping fewer and fewer of you are familiar with each topic. This series is decades old, so I can't win them all, but I'm trying. Dumbledore's name. Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, headmaster of Hogwarts, and also named after the dog from Family Guy, or maybe Monty Python. I can only find 2 instances of his full name being used. Once, when he shows up to court for Harry in Order of the Phoenix, and second, when his last will and testament is being read in Deathly Hallows. Now, there are plenty of memes out there about Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, but there is really only a stated explanation behind his name, Dumbledore. According to J.K. Rowling, Dumbledore is an Old English word, meaning bumblebee. Because Albus Dumbledore is very fond of music, I always imagined him as sort of humming to himself a lot. Perhaps interesting in itself, as that is not a piece of the character we ever really see. A Dumbledore humming to himself, or putting on some smooth wizard jazz and reading a good book. A little fun fact, if you use Google's Ngram viewer, which basically just lets you search through old scanned text for word usage, Dumbledore used to be used quite frequently. Some in the 1800s, and then for some reason in the 1900s we started exclusively using the word bumblebee instead. Door was a Middle English word that meant buzzing or whirring insect, and the dumble portion might have also been used interchangeably with bumble, humble, drumble, or any number of other similar words. Albus is the Latin word for white, which you would obviously think, oh, great, that matches his long white beard and hair. Perfect. Except, of course, for the fact that he obviously was not born with either of those things. So I guess that might have just been a reference to, like, purity? Although, I don't know if Dumbledore is necessarily the most pure character either. Moving on. Percival is an interesting one. Not only was Percival the name of a knight in King Arthur's Round Table, it might also be derived from an old French spelling meaning he who breaks through the valley. You could probably take this a number of ways, but my interpretation would be an allusion to the biblical Valley of the Shadow of Death, perhaps implying Dumbledore's death was in some way a spear that pierced the veil, enabling Voldemort's eventual downfall. Wulfric literally translates from an Old English name meaning wolf ruler or wolf power. Though I don't think it literally means that he has wolf powers, I think it's more likely meant as a reference to his leadership and some sort of keeping the pack together, so to speak. And then we have Brian. This can go one of two ways. One, it's from an Old English or Irish word meaning high or noble, or two, it's just plain old Brian, and it doesn't get any deeper than that. You can take it either way you want. I have a feeling that it's maybe a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B. I can't imagine J.K. Rowling lightly choosing the name Brian and not thinking about how kind of ridiculous it feels combined with Percival and Wulfric. To each their own. Dumbledore's Phoenix. That title is a bit of a misnomer. I'm not actually writing about Fawkes, though he certainly deserves a video mention at some point. Or maybe an entire video, who knows. What I'm actually talking about is the two resistance groups that exist in the Harry Potter universe. One led by Harry, the other led by Dumbledore. You probably recognize these as Dumbledore's Army and the Order of the Phoenix, and you'd be right. Mostly. J.K. Rowling has an assortment of notes that have been released through auctions and such, detailing some of her early thought processes while writing each book. One example is a single sheet of loose leaf turned horizontally. As someone who enjoys both writing and a well-organized spreadsheet, this is the sweet spot. Alongside the left column, there is a chapter number, a month of the year, and a roughed-in chapter title, basically providing a rough timeline for the plot as it continues forward. Important when every book you write must be confined to a school year. Across the top, there are several buckets, labeling general plot, prophecy, which I assume includes notes about how that chapter relates to either the Chosen One prophecy or the climactic battle in the Ministry of Magic. Then we have this Cho-Ginny love triangle columns for Dumbledore's Army, and one for Order of the Phoenix, followed by one that says Snape/Harry plus something. I can't really read this word, but that includes all of the Snape and Harry interactions, such as learning occlumency, which includes this great little note, Snape going ape at Harry because he can't do it, and then this whole section about Hagrid and Grop. But hold on, let's go back to the Snape and Harry section. The first box here says, Harry skips lesson to recruit for O of P. So, wait, hold on. Harry recruiting for the Order of the Phoenix? That doesn't make any sense unless you consider that both of these rebel armies were flip-flopped. Dumbledore's group originally being named very obviously after himself, Dumbledore's Army, whereas Harry's ragtag group of students was once called the Order of the Phoenix, a somewhat mature name for a bunch of students to come up with. Regardless, I do think both names are better suited for their final associations. What becomes the Order of the Phoenix makes much more sense with it not being explicitly tied to Dumbledore's name, just in case the Ministry of Magic discovered it, for example. Although, I have to say, it is still called the Order of the Phoenix. Depending on what you consider canon, there's really only one domesticated phoenix around, and it belongs to Dumbledore. So, it's not really that sneaky of a name, but anyways, Harry's group goes by Dumbledore's Army, in part so they can reference it as the DA in public without giving it away, and honestly, the name makes a little bit more sense with a group of students that think Dumbledore can do no wrong. Honestly, it's pretty hard to read most of the handwriting on here because there isn't a version that's more than 10 pixels wide, but it does leave me with one major question. Who, or what, is Firehead? A quick edit, I did a little bit more digging, and as I was recording, I think this one is answered. It's more than likely referencing Sirius's talking head in the fire that the trio communicates with. All right, mystery solved, on to the next one. Ron is a seer. Ron in the movies is notoriously dumbed down and turned into a one-man comic relief act, But Book Ron has many talents. Some you might consider prophetic. The start of this rabbit hole is obviously the trio's divination classes in their 3rd year, where Ron accurately predicts several pieces of Harry's future. My turn. Ron peered into Harry's teacup, his forehead wrinkled with effort. "There's a blob a bit like a bowler's hat," he said. "Maybe you're going to work for the Ministry of Magic?" He turned the teacup the other way up. "But this way it looks more like an acorn." "What's that?" He scanned his copy of On Fogging the Future. "A windfall on spected gold?" Now, sometimes people will attribute a quote to Ron of him telling Harry that he'll suffer but be happy about it, but that's not actually a Ron quote in the books. It's a quote of Harry reading Ron's tea leaves. The change was made for the movies, and yet somehow it still works. Although predicting that the main character of a coming-of-age novel is going to go through some suffering is not a huge accomplishment in the first place. But this isn't the first time Ron has made some offhanded comments that wind up with a grain of truth to them. Back up to the Chamber of Secrets and join the trio as they discuss T.M. Riddle's diary. Reminder that this is before they know what T.M. stands for, and before he does his little anagram trick to rearrange the letters. Harry showed her T.M. Riddle's diary and told her the story of how they had found it. "Ooh, it might have some hidden powers," said Hermione enthusiastically, taking the diary and looking at it closely. "If it has, it's hiding them very well," said Ron. "Maybe it's shy, I don't know. Why don't you chuck it, Harry?" "I wish I knew why someone did try to chuck it," said Harry. "I wouldn't mind knowing how Riddle got an award for special services to Hogwarts either." "Could have been anything," said Ron. "Maybe he got 30 owls and saved a teacher from the giant squid. Maybe he murdered Myrtle. That would have done everyone a favor." Did you catch that? Maybe he murdered Myrtle. Sure, it might just be a snide little remark, but it ends up being true. But there's one more example to bring up, which happens all the way at the end of the series in Deathly Hallows. Ron and Hermione and Harry are in their Horcrux hunting phase when Ron finally reaches a breaking point. "Don't say the name," Ron cut across her, his voice harsh. Harry and Hermione looked at each other. "I'm sorry," said Ron, moaning a little as he raised himself to look at them, "but it feels like a jinx or something. Can't we just call him you-know-who, please?" "Dumbledore said fear of a name," began Harry. "In case you hadn't noticed, mate, calling you-know-who by his name didn't do Dumbledore much good in the end," Ron snapped back. Just show you-know-who some respect, will you? The name's been jinxed, Harry. That's how they track people. Using his name breaks protective enchantments. It causes some kind of magical disturbance. It's how they found us in Tottenham Court Road. Because we used his name? Exactly. You've got to give them credit. It makes sense. It was only people who were serious about standing up to him, like Dumbledore, who ever dared use it. Now they've put a taboo on it. Anyone who says it is trackable. Quick and easy way to find Order members. Again, a strangely specific call-out and prediction for Ron to make offhandedly. All the more strange that it ends up being true. In my head, while Ron might not be as practiced as Professor Trelawney, it seems more likely to me that he has some sort of innate seer abilities. Raw potential that has never, and may never, be honed. And that might be for good reason, at least from a storytelling perspective. Here's J.K. Rowling talking about an early character that was pulled from the final version for being too good at telling the future. At one point, there was a blind character who went by the name of Mopsus, and I will let you look him up because there's a mythological connection there, but he sort of was a very early character and he had the power of second sight. In other words, he was a bit like Professor Trelawney. He was a very, very early character. This was when I was drafting Philosopher's Stone. The reason I cut him was he was too good. As the story evolved, if there was somebody who really could do divination at the time that Harry was alive, it greatly diminished the drama of the story because someone out there knew what was going to happen. So, is Ron a seer? The community seems pretty divided on the topic. I'll let you make up your own mind, but I always like when the least expected character ends up having some wild, uncharacteristic power or ability. So I am going to choose to give it to Ron. Arthur Weasley's fate. Maybe I'm gonna draw some ire for this, but Arthur Weasley was never a character that felt especially personal to me. I never felt very connected to him. All the more reason this topic doesn't really bother me all that much. That said, I know for many readers he felt like a father figure. So when he was attacked in Order of the Phoenix by Nagini and almost died, for some of you, that might have actually been quite affecting. He, of course, eventually survives that encounter, but what if I were to tell you that wasn't originally the case? J.K. Rowling originally planned for Arthur Weasley to bite the dust, but ultimately couldn't follow through for a couple of reasons. If there's one character I couldn't bear to part with, it's Arthur Weasley. I think part of the reason for that is there were very few good fathers in the book, said Rowling. In fact, you could make a very good case for Arthur Weasley being the only good father in the whole series. I wanted to kill parents. I wanted there to be an echo of what happened to Harry just to show the absolute evil of Voldemort's doing. I think one of the most devastating things about war is the children left behind, as happened in the first war when Harry's left behind. I wanted us to see another child left behind, and it made it very poignant that it was their newborn son. The newborn son being referred to here is Lupin and Tonks's son, Teddy. So on one hand, there seemed to be some sentimental attachment to Arthur Weasley by book 5, so much so that J.K. Rowling couldn't bring herself to kill him off. But there is a second reason that she's mentioned in other interviews that I think is much more foundational to the story, and frankly, a better thematic reason to keep him around. I think they would have been very different, and it's part of the reason why I chose my mind. By turning Ron into half of Harry, in other words, by turning Ron into someone who had suffered the loss of a parent, I was going to remove the Weasleys as a refuge for Harry, and I was going to necessarily remove a lot of Ron's humor. That's part of the reason why I didn't kill Arthur. I wanted to keep Ron intact. A lot of Ron's humor comes from his insensitivity and his immaturity. And Ron, finally, I think, you see, grows up in this book. He's the last of the three to reach what I consider adulthood, and he does it then when he destroys the Horcrux and faces those things. So that's part of the reason. To me, this makes much more sense. Ron experiencing the death of a parent, especially so late into the series, would have fundamentally changed the trajectory of the story. And honestly, I don't think he gets enough airtime to really expand on that impact. For Harry, he loses Sirius Black, a huge emotional blow, but we also get to spend a lot of time inside Harry's head, working through that trauma. If that happened to Ron, we would have lost the comic relief, with it being replaced by an extraordinarily depressed sidekick. So, not a great trade-off. Not to mention, couple that with how annoyingly angsty Ron gets in Deathly Hallows, and I'm all the more grateful that Arthur powered through to the end. Fred, George, Ron, and Peter. Okay, I don't know exactly where this falls on the fan theory to Iceberg secret to plot hole spectrum, but I can't go a whole video without at least mentioning it. The obvious question that is probably the first potential plot hole that many readers notice with the series, one that goes all the way back to memes posted on 9gag, is the question surrounding Peter Pettigrew showing up on the Marauders map. Let's start with J.K. Rowling's response to the question before we start criticizing. It would not have mattered if they had, unless somebody was very familiar with the story of Sirius Black, and after all, Sirius was not Mr. and Mrs. Weasley's best friend. Indeed, they never knew him until after he escaped from Azkaban. Fred and George would be unlikely to know or remember Peter Pettigrew was the person Sirius had supposedly murdered. Even if Fred and George had heard the story at some point, why would they assume that the Peter Pettigrew they occasionally saw moving around the map was, in fact, the man murdered years before? Fred and George used the map for their own mischief making, so they concentrated, naturally enough, on those portions of the map where they were planning their next misdeeds. And finally, you must not forget that hundreds of little dots are moving around this map at any given time. Fred and George did not know everyone in the school by name, so a single unfamiliar name was unlikely to stand out. All right, so a lot to unpack there, starting with the idea that Fred and George would be unfamiliar with Peter Pettigrew. I mean, I'm willing to accept that, minus the fact that the story of Harry Potter seems to be just about the only topical thing worth knowing in the Harry Potter universe. I guess that's for good reason. Imagine someone had a 100% guaranteed murder spell and then someone ended up being immune to that. You'd probably be interested in the story as well. You might even go so far as to read the news. Either way, it's not out of the question that you might learn or be familiar with the name Peter Pettigrew, and I don't think it's an especially common name. Second, this idea that they may or may not have seen Peter Pettigrew on the map based on the sheer number of dots, I mean, honestly, I'm just calling BS on this. Not only do we know that the twins would have regularly used the map, there just simply are not that many people in the Gryffindor Commons. Okay, roleplay for a moment. Imagine you're sneaking around the castle with your magic map that can see everyone's name. You're checking around corners on your way back to your room, and then you also just check the Gryffindor dorm area so you can avoid being caught by other students. There's 0% chance Fred or George Weasley wouldn't have at least incidentally seen Ron on the map while in the dorm, and also seen Peter Pettigrew, or Peter P, right next to him. It wouldn't have even had to have been nighttime, you freaks. It could have been just 7 p.m. in the common room. Oh, who's that? Peter Pettigrew? I don't know a Peter Pettigrew in Gryffindor. I'll ask my brother Ron about that. Oh, he says there's no Peter Pettigrew in his year, and there's no Peter Pettigrew at Hogwarts? Weird. Surely it can't be the same as that other guy with the super unique name. Our magical map must just be faulty. That seems like a stretch. Am I crazy? I mean, what are we even talking about here? There's just no chance they didn't see Peter on the map. I'm fine with the idea that they wouldn't have known who he was, but don't pretend they wouldn't have seen him. Everyone is always like, why would they be looking at their brother? And I'm like, how would they not just happen to have seen their brother's name next to the same name every day for years? Fred and George were just so accepting of their brother that no matter how many nights he spent with Peter, they just never brought it up. All the more reason to drop down a whole nother level. Let's move on to level 3. Moving on. Level 3. We're starting to get into some topics that are probably not common knowledge, or at the very least, maybe some ideas you haven't heard of, despite this series being 3 decades old. This is where things start to get really interesting. So I hope you've made it this far, and if you have, consider taking 2 seconds to subscribe to the channel. There's a 95% chance that if you're watching right now, you aren't subscribed. You've watched like 40 minutes, so you're clearly liking something, or you're just sleeping, which is also okay as well. Keep sleeping, that's fine. Sleep tight. Let's jump into level 3 with something that seems all but obvious in hindsight. Asphodel and Wormwood. I see this topic every once in a while when I'm scrolling through TikTok, but I never really looked into it. In fact, I hesitated to really even include it on here because at first, I couldn't really track down a source, but after some digging, I think I have found it. First, let's take a look at the context. This is Harry's first potions class with Professor Snape in his first year at Hogwarts. In fact, I do think it's also his first interaction, period, with Snape. Potter, said Snape suddenly, what would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood? Powdered root of what to an infusion of what? Harry glanced at Ron, who looked as stumped as he was. Hermione's hand had shot into the air. I don't know, sir, said Harry. Snape's lips curled into a sneer. Tut, tut. Fame clearly isn't everything. Sit down, he snapped at Hermione. For your information, Potter, asphodel and wormwood make a sleeping potion so powerful it's known as the Drought of Living Death. So that's the excerpt. From there, you'll find a ton of videos proclaiming that asphodel is a type of lily that in Victorian flower language means my regrets follow you to the grave, and that wormwood means absence or sorrow. So Snape is telling Harry in code that he bitterly regrets Lily's death. All that said, I couldn't really figure out where this came from because J.K. Rowling never seems to acknowledge this idea in any interviews. But I kept digging, and what I tracked down is what I believe to be the origins of this theory. It comes from a 2008 Harry Potter fanfiction titled Oh God, Not Again. It's basically a what if Harry relived his time at Hogwarts but kept all the knowledge he had picked up along the way type of story. He relives a bunch of the same scenes, like the one above with Snape, however, he answers every question correctly. It's kind of like a weird power fantasy thing. The part about Asphodel and Wormwood also has this excerpt. If he recalled correctly, Asphodel was a type of lily, meaning my regrets follow you to the grave, and Wormwood means absence, and also typically symbolized bitter sorrow. If you combined that, it meant, I bitterly regret Lily's death. Now, there's no way a normal first year would have been able to get that, and Harry didn't even know if Snape meant to convey that, but it just seemed like too big of a coincidence. Out of all the potions Snape could have asked about, he chose that. So that explains where the often repeated line that Wormwood means regret comes from. As an added bonus, Asphodel is a type of lily commonly associated with the dead in Greek mythology, spreading throughout Elysium, an area within the underworld where the souls of heroes and the most virtuous people tend to reside. So that part stands, and the Victorian flower language part also seems to be accurate from what I can tell. But as for the Wormwood translation, it's a bit of a journey. Eventually you'll find that absinthe, the drink, also can be used to refer to the wormwood plant in French. The words can be the same. They all can come from the ancient Greek word absinthium, which may mean undrinkable, landing us all the way back at the bitter translation. So if you came here for your daily Greek lesson, that was it. Whether this is a true theory or just some fan fiction that spilled over into canon territory, you'll have to be the judge of that. I will say, in my time writing these videos, if there's one thing J.K. Rowling seems to have spent a lot of time on, it's naming and wordplay. There are hidden meanings behind so many names and words used in this series. I will probably have to make an entire video on it, but for now, let's just move on to the next topic. The basilisk is just a normal snake. I'm working on an entire video about the basilisk, so I will probably have that posted at some point. There's a combination of things that go wrong with the basilisk, but I do think a lot of it comes down to the way the basilisk is shown in the movies versus the way it's described in the books. I know this is a somewhat controversial topic, so let's at least dive into the supporting evidence, starting with the way that the basilisk is described in Chamber of Secrets. It starts with Harry seeing the shed skin of the basilisk. The light slid over a gigantic snakeskin of a vivid, poisonous green, lying curled and empty across the tunnel floor. The creature that had shed it must have been 20 feet long at least. 20 feet long in and of itself is not that long, especially not considering how the snake is described moments later when Harry comes face to face with it. The enormous serpent, bright, poisonous green, thick as an oak trunk, had raised itself high in the air, and its great blunt head was weaving drunkenly between the pillars. Harry was on his feet, ready. The basilisk's head was falling, its body coiling around, hitting pillars as it twisted to face him. He could see the vast, bloody eye sockets, see the mouth stretching wide enough to swallow him whole, lined with fangs long as his sword, thin, glittering, venomous. So, 20 feet long is basically your living room, compared with the ability to swallow a 12-year-old whole. I'm assuming that when Harry says wide enough to swallow him whole, he means that its mouth is like 5 or 6 feet wide. So the snake from the books is maybe 4 feet wide? We'll move on, but a 20-foot long, 4-foot wide snake is ridiculous, especially when compared to the description in the Fantastic Beasts companion book, which says it can reach 50 feet in length. All this, and I haven't even mentioned the main problem I have with the size of the basilisk. How is it moving around the castle? Sure, I understand that it might have had a larger pipe to exit the Chamber of Secrets, but what about the rest of the castle? At some point it had to leave the pipes and slither around the hallways. Why isn't there evidence? There are probably 100 comments on the other video reminding me that snakes aren't slimy. thanks, I get it, but the sentiment is the same. What about knocked over statues and trails across the grass in the quad? I think what it comes down to is its method of killing and the way that it's portrayed to the audience. In a movie, it's really hard to show that eye contact is instantly lethal, especially for an audience of children. So how do you make an otherwise normally sized snake scarier? Well, you make it the size of a 747. Enormous. But in doing so, you create a rift between the book basilisk and the movie basilisk. In an ink and paper format, it's a lot easier to build the tension and explain to the audience the risk of looking into the eyes of a basilisk. You read about it multiple times and you see the effects described slowly, and you can properly absorb the danger. So all the arguments I have about the basilisk mostly fall away when you replace the movie monstrosity with a dainty little snake that can kill with a glance, but it certainly does feel a little bit less dangerous when it's just a normal-sized snake, doesn't it? Vanishing body trick. All right, I have read a lot of Harry Potter commentary in the past year, but this is one that somehow I had just never come across. The beauty of it is that you can find a random Reddit thread from 12 years ago with no comments, despite the original poster bringing up a really interesting topic, so I'm here to bring that full circle. When Voldemort is killed in Deathly Hallows, he, perhaps famously, disintegrates like a Thanos snap, floating away as dust. But if you were paying attention to the books, that's not exactly how things play out. Harry, with the unerring skill of the Seeker, caught the wand in his free hand as Voldemort fell backward, arms splayed, the slit pupils of the scarlet eyes rolling upward. Tom Riddle hit the floor with a mundane finality, his body feeble and shrunken, the white hands empty, the snake-like face was vacant and unknowing. Voldemort was dead, killed by his own rebounding curse, and Harry stood with two wands in his hand, staring down at his enemy's shell. They moved Voldemort's body and laid it in a chamber off the hall, away from the bodies of Fred, Tonks, Lupin, Colin Creevey, and 50 others who had died fighting him. Let's start there. If there was ever a time for Voldemort's body to disintegrate, it would have been in the final climactic battle, but it doesn't. Harry and crew have to dispose of it. The other time we see this is in the first movie when we see Professor Quirrell disintegrate. Only that doesn't happen in the books either. I don't know why they just like showing people disintegrating in movies. This raises the main point of this topic. Voldemort would have left a body behind the first time he died, when he attacked the Potters. So what happened to it? There clearly isn't an easy answer because even McGonagall in the first book believes that Voldemort has disappeared. Professor McGonagall shot a sharp look at Dumbledore and said, "The owls are nothing next to the rumors that are flying around. You know what everyone's saying about why he disappeared? About what finally stopped him?" Based on her comments, I think we're meant to interpret this as no body being found at the scene of the crime. The common explanation I seem to see is that when Voldemort's spell backfired against Lily Potter's protection, it exploded, destroying both the Potter's house and Voldemort's body. From what I can gather, this is coming from the sign at the Potter's house in Deathly Hallows, which reads, "On this spot, on the night of 31st of October 1981, Lily and James Potter lost their lives. Their son, Harry, remains the only wizard ever to have survived the killing curse. This house, invisible to Muggles, has been left in its ruined state as a monument to the Potters and as a reminder of all the violence that tore apart their family." I've got a couple issues with this. First and foremost, Lily and James have real tombstones. They were buried. They had bodies that they buried. So I don't know why only Voldemort's body would have been destroyed by the blast. And before you say, well, maybe their bodies were destroyed as well, you don't know that. It might have just only hit Voldemort. Okay, but Harry's alive and unscathed. Sure, the explosion might have been directional, I guess, but Harry is a 2-year-old or a 1-year-old. Explosions are not good for 1-year-olds. And on top of all that, Dumbledore makes a comment while Harry is in limbo that I think reveals the truth. You were the seventh Horcrux, Harry, the Horcrux he never meant to make. He had rendered his soul so unstable that it broke apart when he committed those acts of unspeakable evil. The murder of your parents, the attempted killing of a child, but what escaped from that room was even less than he knew. He left more than his body behind. He left part of himself latched to you, the would-be victim who had survived. Even though McGonagall is under the impression that Voldemort disappeared, Dumbledore seems to know differently. And I think that's the key. If Dumbledore knows about a body, but McGonagall doesn't, the most logical conclusion I can come to is that Dumbledore did something about it. That's right, Voldemort left the body behind, and Dumbledore fixed it. Either hiding his original body or otherwise destroying it so that the wizarding world didn't have to have a definitive conclusion on Voldemort's fate. Did he die? Did he go into hiding? No one's sure. And for Dumbledore, who suspected he might not be gone for good, he would want the magical world to be wary of Voldemort's return. Where he put the body, we'll never know. I would have to assume it's either obliterated or sent to the bottom of the ocean, and like that body, we need to keep moving down this iceberg. Time and place. Within the first book, Philosopher's Stone, there are a few interactions that stick out as strange, outside the normal scope of strange within a magical world. One of these is Harry's meeting with the centaurs in the Forbidden Forest, when Firenze saves him from the Quirrell-Voldemort hybrid. 3 times, they respond to Hagrid and crew that Mars is bright tonight. Mars, of course, representing conflict, war, violence, all of the above. After Harry is saved, there's a small moment of dialogue between the 2 centaurs, Bane and Firenze. "What have you been telling him?" growled Bane. "Remember, Firenze, we are sworn not to set ourselves against the heavens. Have we not read what is to come in the movements of the planets?" And then later, towards the end of the chapter, Harry summarized the centaur's position on his life. "Firenze saved me, but he shouldn't have done so." Bane was furious. He was talking about interfering with what the planets say is going to happen. They must show that Voldemort's coming back. Bane thinks Firenze should have let Voldemort kill me. I suppose that's written in the stars as well. You may have read this as a child and kind of skimmed over it, ignoring the implications of this prophecy, but with hindsight and a combined PDF of every book where I can just search for instances of the word Mars, you might notice something interesting. Mars actually comes up a couple more times, and it's never wrong. First, in Goblet of Fire, Harry's death is foreshadowed again. He therefore had to endure over an hour of Professor Trelawney, who spent half the lesson telling everyone that the position of Mars with relation to Saturn at the moment meant that people born in July were in danger of a sudden, violent death. "Well, that's good," said Harry loudly, his temper getting the better of him. "Just as long as it's not drawn out, I don't want to suffer." I'll admit that when I first read the book, I really doubt I even paid attention to that line. I probably didn't even remember that Harry's birthday was in July, but that's the beauty of revisiting this all now. So, a sudden violent death. Avada Kedavra is famously an extremely sudden death, so it's spot on. But Mars is also mentioned again by Firenze in Order of the Phoenix when he subs in for divination class. Firenze pointed to the red star directly above Harry. In the past decade, the indications have been that wizard kind is living through nothing more than a brief calm between 2 wars. Mars, bringer of battle, shines brightly above us, suggesting that the fight must break out again soon. How soon centaurs may attempt to divine by burning certain herbs and leaves by the observation of fume and flame. The point of all this is to say yes, the centaurs were right about Harry's death, they just weren't right about the timing. It was written in the stars that Voldemort would kill Harry in the very same forest, as a matter of fact. He just didn't get around to it for another 7 years. So really, we should probably be paying attention to everything else the centaurs are talking about. It might have been pretty useful in, solving another wizarding war. Bad memories. Speaking of Voldemort's reign of terror and his death the first time around, it's possible that we were given a front row seat to his death without even knowing it. In case you don't know, here is how Lupin describes Dementors in Prisoner of Azkaban, as well as Harry's description of what he experiences when they attack. Dementors are among the foulest creatures that walk this earth. They infest the darkest, filthiest places. They glory in decay and despair. They drain peace, hope, and happiness out of the air around them. Even Muggles feel their presence, even though they can't see them. Get too near a Dementor, and every good feeling, every happy memory will be sucked out of you. If it can, the Dementor will feed on you long enough to reduce you to something like itself, soulless and evil. You'll be left with nothing but the worst experiences of your life. And the worst that happened to you, Harry, is enough to make anyone fall off their broom. You have nothing to feel ashamed of. When they get near me, Harry stared at Lupin's desk, his throat tight. I can hear Voldemort murdering my mum. This one relies on one key figure, Harry's age at the time of his parents' murder. He's about a year and maybe 3 months old when that happens, meaning I sincerely doubt he has any memories from that period of his life. Psychologists seem to settle on the 3rd birthday as the time when infantile amnesia begins to fade. That's the scientific name for our inability to remember specific moments from our earliest years. Specific moments such as that time a murderer broke into your home and tried to kill you. Instead, it's entirely possible, and dare I say plausible, that the memory Harry is experiencing is not exactly his own, but rather a memory from the piece of Voldemort's soul inside him. Remember, it was a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day for Voldemort as well. Here's the memory in question from Prisoner of Azkaban. "Go," said Lupin, pulling off the lid. The room went icily cold and dark once more. The Dementor glided forward, drawing its breath. One rotting hand was extending toward Harry. "Expecto Patronum!" Harry yelled. "Expecto Patronum! Expecto pa..." White fog obscured his senses. Big blurred shapes were moving around him. Then came a new voice, a man's voice, shouting, panicking. "Lily, take Harry and go. It's him. Go, run, I'll hold him off." The sounds of someone stumbling from a room, a door bursting open, a cackle of high-pitched laughter. "Harry! Harry, wake up!" Lupin was tapping Harry hard on the face. This time it was a minute before Harry understood why he was lying on a dusty classroom floor. "I heard my dad," Harry mumbled. "That's the first time I've ever heard him. He tried to take on Voldemort himself, to give my mom time to run for it." Harry suddenly realized that there were tears on his face, mingling with the sweat. He bent his face as low as possible, wiping them off his robes, pretending to do up his shoelace so that Lupin wouldn't see. "You heard James?" said Lupin in a strange voice. I know you may be saying that these memories appear to come from Harry's perspective, but I would argue that maybe it's a combination of both. A little bit of column Harry, a little bit of column Voldemort, combining into the foggy nightmares we see here. All the more reason Lupin thinks it's strange for Harry to have heard James, because Harry wouldn't remember that. Maybe he would remember general emotions, but I think Voldemort's soul is filling in the words around the event. Now, Harry and Voldemort might be sad, but you don't have to be, because we're moving down to level 4. Moving on, I'm starting to pull out some pieces of lore that are pretty buried within the series or random interviews J.K. Rowling has done. I expect some of you will know some of these, but I can't not include them. This is an Iceberg video, after all. The casualties of war. J.K. Rowling will admit freely that the numbers and dates in the series are not her strong suit. If you go digging or check through some of my other videos, you'll notice that there are a number of times where the timing of things or the basic math of it is off. In the first page of the first book, Mr. Dursley mentions that it's Tuesday when he's going to work, when we all know that Halloween 1981, the day Voldemort killed Harry's parents, was a Saturday. So Vernon Dursley was either going to work on a Saturday or a Sunday. Dudley has a PlayStation in the summer of 1994, 6 months before PlayStation was released. And the topic at hand, no one knows for sure how many students there are supposed to be at Hogwarts. Not you, not me, not J.K. Rowling. I'll show her explanation first, but there might actually be a more logical explanation that I'll show after. A lot of this comes down to the fact that Harry only seems to have about 40 classmates in his year, while J.K. Rowling has otherwise claimed that there are 1,000 students at Hogwarts. When asked about this, here's what she had to say. Well, Hogwarts. All right, here's the thing about Hogwarts. Way before I finished Philosopher's Stone, when I was just amassing stuff for 7 years, between having the idea and publishing the book, I sat down and I created 40 kids who enter Harry's year. I'm delighted I did it because it was so useful. I got 40 pretty fleshed out characters. I never had to stop and invent someone. I know who's in the year, I know who's in which house, I know what their parentage is, and I have a few personal details on all of them. So there were 40. I never consciously thought that's it, that's all the people in his year, but that's kind of how it worked out. Then I've been asked a few times about how many people, and because numbers are not my strong point, one part of my brain knew 40 and another part of my brain said, oh, about 600 sounds right. Then people started working it out and saying, where are the other kids sleeping? We have a little bit of a dilemma there. I mean, obviously magic is very rare. I wouldn't want to say a precise ratio, but if you assume that all of the wizarding children are being sent to Hogwarts, then that's very few wizard to muggle population, isn't it? There will be the odd kid whose parents don't want them to go to Hogwarts, but 600 out of the whole of Brittany is tiny. Let's say 3,000 in Britain, actually thinking about it, and then think of all the magical creatures, some of which appear human. So then you got things like hags, trolls, ogres, and so on, and that's really bumping up your numbers. And then you've got the world of sad people like Filch and Fig, who are kind of part of the world, but are hangers-on. That's going to bump you up a bit as well. So it's a more sizable total magical community that needs hiding, concealing, but don't hold me to these figures because that's not how I think. Okay, that's a long quote, but off the bat, her explanation makes a lot of sense to me. I can understand the rationale for having the characters you want to focus on at hand. It's a very different approach than other authors like Tolkien or George R.R. Martin, where there are hundreds of named characters that get mentioned once and then completely forgotten about. In Harry Potter, we pretty much have the same set of characters for 7 years. And on the flip side, I can also understand how if each class only had 40 students times 7 years, that would only make about 300 total students. And that seems a bit small for the size of adventure that Harry undergoes. You lose a bit of the gravitas if, on one hand, Voldemort is an existential threat that the main characters are fighting, and on the other hand, he only affects 300 or 400 magical people. So I can see how bumping the number up a little bit feels right, in spite of the continuity issues that may cause. So let's not focus on the actual numbers. Instead, think about why Harry's class and potentially the couple years around his might be a little bit smaller. The First Wizarding War, Voldemort's Reign of Terror, almost perfectly explains why Harry's class size might be a little smaller. Voldemort and the Death Eaters were killing a lot of people. You don't have to take my word for it. This is Sirius Black describing it to the main trio. All right, I'll try you. He walked up the cave, back again, and then said, imagine that Voldemort's powerful now. You don't know who his supporters are, you don't know who's working for him, and who isn't. You know he can control people so that they do terrible things without being able to stop themselves. You're scared for yourself and your family and your friends. Every week, news comes of more deaths, more disappearances, more torturing. The Ministry of Magic's in disarray. They don't know what to do. They're trying to keep everything hidden from the Muggles. Meanwhile, Muggles are dying too. Terror everywhere, panic, confusion. That's how it used to be. The First Wizarding War started sometime in 1970 and ran all the way to Voldemort's first death in 1981, which leaves 11 years where there wasn't a great reason to bring a child into the world. Fast forward to the Hogwarts in the books, and every class above Harry that we see would have been filled with children born during the Wizarding War. So honestly, low enrollment was the least of Hogwarts' concerns. And that's the best explanation I can think for of why Harry's classes and Hogwarts' general enrollment might have been pretty low. Sorting Hat origins. This is one of my favorite facts from the series that truly not many people know about. There are a few things quite as iconic in the Wizarding world, let alone all of fantasy, as the Sorting Hat, at least when it comes to magical items. Maybe it's not quite on the level as the One Ring from Lord of the Rings, but honestly, it's gotta be pretty high on the list. I've got like the One Ring, the Sorting Hat, lightsabers, do those count? There's not a ton of super famous magical items that really come to mind. Anyways, this almost wasn't the case because the Sorting Hat was almost never part of the story at all. As J.K. Rowling describes it, the Sorting Hat came about through multiple iterations and drafts of the first book. The Sorting Hat does not appear in my earliest plans for Hogwarts. I debated several different methods for sorting students because I knew from early on that there would be 4 houses, all with different qualities. The first was an elaborate Heath Robinson-ish machine that did all kinds of magical things before reaching a decision, but I didn't like it. It felt all at once too complicated and too easy. Next, I placed 4 statues of the 4 founders in the entrance hall, which came alive and selected students from the throng in front of them while the school watched. This was better, but still not quite right. Finally, I wrote a list of ways in which people can be chosen. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo, short straws, chosen by team captains, names out of a hat, names out of a talking hat, putting on a hat, the sorting hat. Separately, she also mentions this page of doodles as part of the process she went through to settle on the sorting hat method. This is a page of doodles from which the sorting hat emerged. In the top part of the page are all the possible ways of sorting people I considered. A panel of ghosts or prefects, a magical gateway through which each person would have to pass, and so on. I also thought of drawing names out of a hat, which became the sorting hat. And at the bottom right corner, you can see my first drawing of the sorting hat, with the first 4 lines of its first ever song. Let's break down some of the ideas here. First, her original methods of sorting. Honestly, I can picture the Heath Robinson machine in my head. For my fellow Americans, that's a Rube Goldberg machine. I can picture each student walking up to the front of this machine and dropping in a marble or pulling a lever as 100 magical processes spring into action, bells and whistles, sparks shooting out, potions changing colors, all of it culminating in a tiny little scroll being released with their sorted house written on it. But I also agree with her intuition that it would have been both too complicated and too easy. In my mind, in this version, the student wouldn't really have to interact in any way in order to be sorted. It would seem much more like random chance than a considered placement in a house of their choice. Then she moves on to statues of the founders coming alive. I don't have much to say here except that possibly bringing back 1,000-year-old people might not have been the best course of action, and whether she thought about it at the time or not would have posed quite a few problems when the Chamber of Secrets was opened. Hey, Salazar, you didn't put a Chamber of Secrets somewhere?
Who, me?
In the basement or something like
secret?
that?
What? Secret chamber? Who? What? Me in a basement? No.
Okay, I'm just checking. There's this mythical beast that can kill you with a look that's kind of roaming around the school, and there's a lot of talk about ethnic cleansing and stuff. Just checking.
Oh, that sounds dreadful.
Uh-huh.
That doesn't sound like anything I would do. No, of course not. No.
Yeah, right.
Of course not. Me?
Okay.
Cleansing? Me? No.
Pretty sure that was a good choice. Then she has Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo and picking names out of a hat, both of which kind of sound like giving up. grasping at straws, although it does point towards her eventual solution with the sorting hat. Her doodles also mention a couple interesting methods, a gateway that would have been an interesting method, but I'm not totally sure how it would have actually selected the house. I also wonder if somehow it got recycled into the veil in the Ministry of Magic. A question or riddle actually seems pretty fitting. I can imagine it being asked in a way where there isn't one solution, and depending on how the student answers, that helps sort them. Like, if they solve a problem with bravery, they're placed in Gryffindor. If they solve it by murdering someone, then they go in Slytherin. If they're too scared to confront somebody, Hufflepuff, I guess. And if they're like a nerd about it, Ravenclaw. Something like that. When I wrote this script, I hadn't actually taken a sorting hat quiz in a long time, and so I'll have to try it out again. Spoiler, it put me in Slytherin, which is probably fair. And the poll I put out on the channel had like 1,300 of you respond, and Ravenclaw's super popular, so is Gryffindor. Way more Hufflepuffs than I thought, but, you know, good on ya. Anyway, on to the next one. Elemental laws. Up next, something that maybe people would probably call a plot hole. I'm not entirely disagreeing with you, but I also have to leave it, at the very least, up to you. So I'll present the argument that it isn't a plot hole, and then you can decide for yourself. This might sound familiar. You're watching Harry Potter, or really any number of magic-based fantasy shows, and there's this nagging question in the back of your mind. Couldn't they just fix blank with magic? Couldn't they just make money? Couldn't they just make food? Couldn't they just conjure up clothes? Couldn't they fix any number of problems with magic and a flick of their wand? This kind of problem is one that happens with any magical story. I guess maybe it eventually goes back to entropy or something. There's probably another video in here, but I've got too many ideas to work on. But you're sitting there thinking, magic could pretty much fix every issue, right? And it takes you out of the story a little bit because it essentially removes the stakes and the tension. And then you find the author of the story has basically put in place some rules that stop these plot holes from existing. In the case of some other stories, it's tied to the magic person's mortality, like Aragon. Magic takes the same amount of energy as physically doing the action, and if it takes too much energy, it kills you. Man, I loved Aragon. That is such a throwback. I'm gonna make another video about Aragon at some point. In Harry Potter, none of those limits seem to really exist. A wizard can just cast a powerful spell by concentrating harder, and it doesn't really seem to tire you out, at least not enough to kill you. Wingardium Leviosa would otherwise be a terrible first spell to teach new students. So then what about conjuration? Why not just make more food, money, etc.? Well, does J.K. Rowling have an answer for you? If you want it, that is. I'll be honest, things get a little fuzzy between what J.K. Rowling says in the year 2000 and what is written in the books 7 years later. The interviewer in question is basically asking, if wizards can summon anything they want, why are the Weasleys poor? They shouldn't really have anything to worry about, right? A very good question. There is legislation about what you can conjure and what you can't. Something that you conjure out of the air will not last. This is a rule I set down for myself early on. I love these logical questions. All right, legislation is a weird way to put it. That doesn't sound like it would actually stop anyone from doing something if they needed it. If conjuring food was illegal, but also possible, I would definitely conjure some if I needed it. My guess is that these laws that J.K. Rowling formulated in the early days are actually what becomes GAMP's laws over the course of years and years, but let's hear it from Hermione first. This is from Deathly Hallows. Ron is complaining about the food when she finally breaks. "Your mother can't produce food out of thin air," said Hermione. "No one can. Food is the first of the 5 principal exceptions to GAMP's law of elemental transfigure." "Oh, speak English, can't you?" Ron said, prizing a fishbone out from between his teeth. "It's impossible to make good food out of nothing. You can summon it if you know where it is. You can transform it. you can increase the quantity if you've already got some. Right away, this kind of sets off some alarm bells. You can't summon it out of thin air, but you can increase its quantity. So if I had 1 pizza and then I double it to 2 pizzas, that extra pizza is somehow not summoned out of thin air? This is another one where I'm sure some of you maybe have some comments, and maybe this belongs in a more plot hole follow-up video that I'll be working on, but as it stands, this feels all but completely unexplained. I've seen a lot of discussion around what is possible with magic and what isn't, and when it comes to food, the only explanation that begins to make sense to me is that the food might not have nutritional value. Even this is pretty dubious because Dumbledore regularly conjures a feast for everyone when they show up on the first day, but at least it attempts to explain the law. Maybe no matter how much conjured food you eat, it will never sustain you. Maybe it feels like you're eating real food, but in the same way J.K. Rowling says that conjured objects won't last, if you eat conjured food, I guess it might disappear after you eat it? Poof, right out of your stomach? Big issues on the first night of Dumbledore's feast if he feeds a bunch of kids and then all those kids are suddenly super hungry a couple hours later. But we'll just have to move past that. We've spent enough time here. Smart art. Speaking of another topic that seems like it could maybe fall into another plot hole video, paintings. Specifically, those completely sentient portraits. Did you know that in order for a portrait to actually be somewhat intelligent, it had to be trained? I think I originally thought that once they were painted, they just kind of sprang to life, which they kind of do, but the actual personality and capability of the subject has to be taught. Now, to be fair, most of the magical portraits we see in the Potterverse were not all that smart. And for those random portraits, they might be born, so to speak, with a limited ability to mimic their subject. Pottermore explains as much. Hogwarts portraits are able to talk and move around from picture to picture. They behave like their subjects. However, the degree to which they can interact with the people looking at them depends not on the skill of the painter, but on the power of the witch or wizard painted. But that isn't all it has to say about these magical portraits. It also calls out one notable exception. Traditionally, a headmaster or headmistress is painted before their death. Once the portrait is completed, the headmaster or headmistress in question keeps it under lock and key, regularly visiting it in its cupboard, if so desired, to teach it to act and behave exactly like themselves, and imparting all kinds of useful memories and pieces of knowledge that may then be shared through the centuries with their successors in office. So there is a distinction between portraits. Not all portraits are created equal. And the fact that their mobility is based on their subject's power, we have to assume that Dumbledore's portrait was particularly interactive, which is pretty clear in Book 7 when we see it giving instructions to Snape, as well as this final conversation with Harry. He directed his words at Dumbledore, however, and chose them with enormous care. Exhausted and bleary-eyed though he was, he must make one last effort, seeking one last piece of advice. "The thing that was hidden in the snitch," he began. "I dropped it in the forest. I don't know exactly where, but I'm not going to go looking for it again. Do you agree?" "My dear boy, I do," said Dumbledore, while his fellow pictures looked confused and curious. "A wise and courageous decision, but no less than I would have expected of you. Does anyone else know where it fell?" "No one," said Harry, and Dumbledore nodded his satisfaction. I'm realizing this as I'm speaking it out loud that maybe the reason Harry is being sort of cagey about what exactly he dropped in the woods is so that the other portraits don't potentially understand that it's the resurrection stone. There's also a specific idea that floats around once someone starts thinking about these portraits. Why couldn't Harry have just asked Portrait Dumbledore for help along the way in Deathly Hallows? Why did he have to struggle his way through? J.K. Rowling has actually answered that question. Dumbledore's rationale being that Harry needed to discover the Horcruxes, his purpose, and the Deathly Hallows slowly so as not to act rashly, as he had done in almost every other instance. But there are also a couple other reasons that she laid out. First of all, I created a lot of rules for this world and then later had to navigate my way around them. But this rule was always good. And the rule was that portraits could only move between portraits in the same building. So if I'm a picture and you're a picture and we're both in Carnegie Hall, then we can move into each other's pictures. Otherwise, we can only move to other places where we have a portrait. You can't just move willy-nilly through all the Louvre, the Met. You can't do a world tour as a picture person. You're limited by geography. So there was that reason. And then lastly, of course, third reason is it really would be too easy and I wouldn't have had a plot. First and foremost, I agree. She's right in that everything would have just been too easy if Dumbledore just told Harry everything. Secondly, a couple misconceptions to clear up. A, Dumbledore didn't know where the Horcruxes were, so he really couldn't have helped Harry find those. If he did, he would have hunted them all down before he died. B, there was a chance that if Dumbledore told Harry everything he knew, Voldemort might have been able to read Harry's mind through their Horcrux link, spoiling any advantage Harry and Dumbledore had. And C, lastly, sometimes I need to remind myself that just because something didn't happen doesn't mean that it's a plot hole. Even if characters are smart or resourceful, they aren't perfect, so you can't expect every choice to be guided by perfect, omniscient decision-making. Although, at the end of it all, it does leave me with two questions. One, are there any other portraits that Dumbledore trained lying around somewhere? Backups with his knowledge just in case something happened to the original? And two, I wonder if Harry ever goes back to Hogwarts just to chat with Dumbledore. Even after all those years, he must still have some questions, even like personal coaching on super powerful magic or something. It seems like a wasted opportunity to talk to the most powerful wizard ever, but maybe that's just me. The truth about Veritaserum. The next topic is a bit of a running theme in the series. Some piece of magic is introduced in the series that solves a problem in the moment, but you're left with a sense that it could have solved many other problems in many other moments. Time turners are a prime example of this phenomenon. They solve every issue posed to the main characters, or at least I think they do. Maybe they create and solve issues. It's not super clear exactly how time turners work, but that's for another conversation. Either way, as the reader or watcher, you're left thinking, why don't they just use X for Y? Why don't they use time turners to save Cedric or stop Harry from going to the graveyard? Why don't they use liquid luck? Like, all the time. And before you come at me in the comments, I know liquid luck has some issues and might make the user increasingly reckless over time, but that doesn't change the fact that there is still a tangible effect on the otherwise nebulous concept of luck. Then we get to Veritaserum. I keep saying Veritasium. Shout out Veritasium. It's a potion that, according to Severus Snape, is a truth potion so powerful that 3 drops would have you spilling your innermost secrets for the entire class to hear. A little interesting change I noticed in the movie here, when Alan Rickman says this line, he says that 3 drops would have you-know-who himself, i.e. Voldemort, spilling his darkest secrets. And I suspect that's where a lot of the confusion comes in. Just how powerful is Veritaserum? Now, I will say that even though some of these magical items feel like they introduce some enormous plot holes, J.K. Rowling has introduced some guardrails to stop you from flying your broom off a cliff. I guess that metaphor doesn't really hold up when you can do magic. Veritaserum works best upon the unsuspecting, the vulnerable, and those insufficiently skilled, in one way or another, to protect themselves against it. Barty Crouch had been attacked before the potion was given to him and was still very groggy. Otherwise, he could have employed a range of measures against the potion. He might have sealed his own throat and faked a declaration of innocence, transformed the potion into something else before it touched his lips, or employed occlumency against its effects. In other words, just like every other kind of magic within the books, Veritaserum is not infallible, as some wizards can prevent themselves being affected, and others cannot. It is an unfair and unreliable tool to use at a trial. One thing I will say is that if the potency of Veritaserum is so unclear that the movies made different claims, maybe we should take J.K. Rowling's comments with a grain of salt. But I'm not the first to suggest that. In her defense, Dumbledore does make a comment in Half-Blood Prince about a skilled wizard, Slughorn, in this instance, being able to resist both Legilimency, mind reading, and Veritaserum. So there is at least some canon explanation for not using it constantly to solve every issue. I will say the one thing that continues to bug me is that the ways to defend against a powerful magical attack or potion or what have you often feel like they were afterthoughts. Veritaserum works, but only if you're surprised by it. Time Turners work, but also a 2015 Pottermore article says that they can only go back 5 hours. And also, Harry knocked over and destroyed all of the Time Turners in existence that one time. Oops. The invisibility cloak is perfect unless you cast a spell that reveals humans and then you can see them. So, not all that useful. I'll get off my soapbox now and you can make up your own mind as we travel down to the 5th and final layer of the iceberg. All right, moving down. We've arrived at a place where there are at least a couple items in here that I have never heard of or otherwise given much of a second thought. Which means, hopefully, you're the same. And if you're sitting here and you know all of these, well, hopefully at least you're enjoying yourself. Enough small talk, on to level 5. Missing Mafalda. The characters in Harry Potter are a pretty tight cast. You obviously know and follow around our main trio for 7 years, but the individuals around them don't really change all that much in their time at Hogwarts. There are characters that come and go, but by and large, if someone is off the page, they pretty much drop out of existence, which goes double for one specific character who never got a single appearance on the page, one Mafalda Pruitt. Mafalda was a cut character, but unlike some other characters that didn't make it past the initial idea, Mafalda seems to have made it pretty far along. Mafalda was the daughter of the second cousin, who's a stockbroker, mentioned in Philosopher's Stone. This stockbroker would have been very rude to Mr. and Mrs. Weasley in the past, but now he and his muggle wife had inconveniently produced a witch. They came back to the Weasleys asking for their help in introducing her to Wizarding Society before she starts at Hogwarts. The Weasleys agreed to taking her for part of the summer, including the Quidditch World Cup, but regretted this almost immediately. Mrs. Weasley suspected that Mafalda's parents simply wanted to get rid of her for a while because she turns out to be the most unpleasant child Mrs. Weasley has ever met. Mafalda was supposed to convey certain information about the Death Eaters to Harry, Ron, and Hermione because as a nosy, eavesdropping Slytherin who likes to impress, she does not keep her mouth shut when she overhears their sons and daughters talking. Unfortunately, however bright I made her, there were obvious limitations to what an 11-year-old closeted at school could discover, whereas Rita Skeeter, whom I subsequently built up to fulfill Mafalda's function, was much more flexible. The best thing about Mafalda was that she was a match for Hermione. To the latter's horror, Mafalda was highly gifted and a real show-off, so that Hermione was torn between deploring the rule-breaking and longing to join in and beat her. First off, I'll say that it's hard to imagine the main trio of Harry, Ron, and Hermione being disrupted by a new character in the 4th book, at least not in any lasting or meaningful way, but there are 2 parts of Mafalda that I think would have been a great addition to the series. First is this idea of her being a match for Hermione. On one hand, I think it's hard to read into that comment too much. Hermione would have been 3 or 4 years older than Mafalda, so skill-wise, it wouldn't make a whole lot of a sense for a first year to upstage a 4th year, or fast forward to 4th year and 7th year. It just would be 2 very distinctly different levels of experience. That said, it could have been a nice to have a counterpart to Hermione's know-it-all attitude, which is pointed out by other characters constantly, by the way. When you reread, I swear every time Hermione says something, it'll be like, "Trolls can't swim," Hermione said in her typical bossy way. It's egregious. It's every single time. The other point that would have done a lot to rehabilitate a certain house was that Mafalda was supposed to be sorted into Slytherin, meaning we would have had this essentially Weasley character living it up in Slytherin, something I don't think has ever happened to a Weasley. And for a house that seemingly has no redeeming qualities, it would have been nice to see a perspective that wasn't from the child of a cult member loyal to a genocidal maniac. J.K. Rowling talked about Slytherin at length in an interview after Deathly Hallows came out, her basic premise being that not all Slytherins are bad, which is not the most inspiring defense and kind of problematic in its own right. So while Mafalda never got to see the light of day, I sure wish we would have been able to get a better sense of the Hogwarts houses besides Gryffindor, the smart ones, these guys, and basically prison inmates. The Three Musketeers. Few things are as iconic to the Harry Potter series as Harry, Ron, and Hermione, the dynamic, terrific trio. But what if I told you that almost wasn't the case? We know now that all three of them make it to the end of the series, but along the way, J.K. Rowling had some different ideas, and one of the three almost bit the dust. Funnily enough, I planned from the start that none of the trio would die. Then, midway through, which I think is a reflection of the fact that I wasn't in a very happy place, I started to think I might polish one of them off, out of sheer spite. There, now you definitely can't have him anymore. But I think in my absolute heart of hearts, although I did seriously considering killing Ron, I wouldn't have done it. Now, this quote comes from an interview done by Daniel Radcliffe on the DVD version of Deathly Hallows Part 2, so it's a bit of a joke, and you have to take it at face value. J.K. Rowling is talking to Daniel Radcliffe here, so it's kind of all in good fun. Would J.K. Rowling actually kill off one of the three? Probably not, but does it introduce some really interesting questions? What would the impact be of killing one of the three main characters? I can imagine the effect would be somewhat similar, if not more pronounced, to killing Arthur Weasley. Can you take three characters that go through some incredibly harrowing events, each time managing to scrape through even just barely and then kill one of them off? Realistically, it would drastically change the way that they approached conflict. I think a lot of the growing up and realizing of their own mortality that Harry does in Deathly Hallows would have come a lot sooner had Ron died in Goblet of Fire or Order of the Phoenix. I also wonder, like I mentioned in a couple other sections, about the echoes of themes that come up in different ways. For example, I wonder if this idea of killing Ron somehow translated into the death of Cedric Diggory. Maybe faced with the reality that she couldn't kill off Ron Weasley, she instead built up a different character and endeared him to both fans and Harry, and then killed him off. This is of course famously the book where the series takes a turn, becoming darker and more adult. This is of course purposeful, so I wonder when writing the story if J.K. Rowling had the large story blocks in place and then had to find a way to fill them. Maybe she had an overarching theme of finding a way that would force Harry to grow up, to start contemplating mortality, and she had to find a way to fill that bucket. Ron would have done so, certainly, but I do think it would have gone too far, potentially ruining both Harry and Hermione by forcing them to pull back into a shell if they had a realistic reaction to Ron's death. So that would have made the rest of the series incredibly dark and vengeful, or they would have had to continue on as usual, ignoring the death of their best friend in a way that would have made them completely unrelatable and would be even less realistic. Either way, I'm glad she decided to keep the three together all the way to the very end so we could see that kind of weird epilogue scene at the end of Deathly Hallows. Dumbledore's ultimate spell. I hesitated to even include this topic here because it's such a can of worms to open, but I guess we'll open it here and then maybe I'll try to unpack it more in a future video. If you ask someone what the most powerful spell in Harry Potter is, I'd guess 99 out of 100 people would say Avada Kedavra, the killing curse. And ordinarily, I feel like I'd have to agree. It's basically the equivalent of a wizard gun. While all the good guys are running around yelling stupefy, the bad guys are just running around shooting magical bullets. Unless they're Neville and they're throwing murderous plants at people. Neville might also be a bad guy. But after I uncovered this topic and the pages and pages of discussion about it, I'm not so sure anymore. We're often told that Dumbledore is one of, if not the most powerful wizard to ever live, and yet we don't really see plain examples of that very often. We see him do things like conjure a chair all the time, but that hardly makes someone worthy of most powerful ever. So when we do see him in an actual battle, an event that really only happens once, it's all the more reason to pay a little extra attention to each and every detail. As always, I'll start with the context from the book, the duel between Voldemort and Dumbledore at the end of Order of the Phoenix. "It was foolish to come here tonight, Tom," said Dumbledore calmly. "The Aurors are on their way. By which time I shall be gone, and you dead," spat Voldemort. He sent another killing curse at Dumbledore but missed, instead hitting the security guard's desk, which burst into flame. Dumbledore flicked his own wand. The force of the spell that emanated from it was such that Harry, though shielded by his stone guard, felt his hair stand on end as it passed, and this time Voldemort was forced to conjure a shining silver shield out of thin air to deflect it. The spell, whatever it was, caused no visible damage to the shield, though a deep, gong-like note reverberated from it, an oddly chilling sound. "You do not seek to kill me, Dumbledore?" called Voldemort. His scarlet eyes narrowed over the top of the shield. "Above such brutality, are you?" "We both know that there are other ways of destroying a man, Tom," Dumbledore said calmly, continuing to walk toward Voldemort as though he had not a fear in the world, as though nothing had happened to interrupt his stroll up the hall. "Merely taking your life would not satisfy me, I admit." "There is nothing worse than death, Dumbledore," snarled Voldemort. "You are quite wrong," said Dumbledore, still closing in upon Voldemort and speaking as lightly as though they were discussing the matter over drinks. Harry felt scared to see him walking along, undefended, shieldless. He wanted to cry out a warning, but his headless guard kept shunting him backwards toward the wall, blocking his every attempt to get out from behind it. "Indeed, your failure to understand that there are things much worse than death has always been your greatest weakness." That's a long quote, but buried within what is otherwise a very frantic and chaotic scene. Think about it, Harry's friends are split up, Sirius Black is dead, Harry's gallivanting around chasing Bellatrix Lestrange, a witch who is undoubtedly a stronger dueler than Harry, and then Voldemort shows up. Harry is, of course, the title character of their book, so we know he's probably never gonna die, but if you can shove that plot armor aside, Harry's in real danger here. And realistically, if Dumbledore hadn't shown up at just the right moment, Harry would have been deathly hallowed a couple books too soon. Instead, Dumbledore protects Harry with a statue, sends other statues running in different directions to bring people to the scene. One statue holds down Bellatrix. It's chaos. It's also the best wizard duel we see in the entire series. Dumbledore and Voldemort are apparating around like Nightcrawler. There's fire whips and spells we've never heard of. Soak it in, because from here on, it's just nameless curses and Avada Kedavra for the next 3 movies. In the midst of this battle, Dumbledore casts a non-verbal spell that makes Harry's hair stand on end and, quote, forced Voldemort to block it with a physical silver shield. Specifically, not just a normal blocking spell. If you're following the logic here, you'll probably get the point. There's only one other spell we know of that requires a physical barrier to block, and Voldemort has been casting it all night, Avada Kedavra. The spell hits Voldemort's shield with a gong sound, which I assume we are supposed to interpret as ominous and forceful. And Voldemort reacts in a very skeptical way, questioning Dumbledore's intentions. So let's pause for a second. At this point, we know Voldemort, at the very least, respects Dumbledore's power, but he also seems somewhat confused, or rather questioning. The way I read that paragraph, he doesn't really know what spell Dumbledore just cast at him. He only knows it won't kill him, but also that he needs to block it. If we view this from Dumbledore's perspective, we know that he really only has a few goals. At the top of his list is finish off Voldemort for good, followed secondarily by keeping Harry safe, at least until it's the right time to have him die, but mostly keep him safe. Dumbledore is aware at this point, and has been since the Chamber of Secrets, that Voldemort has multiple Horcruxes. He doesn't know how many, but he knows there's multiple. So the issue with actually killing Voldemort in the Ministry of Magic, if he were able, is that it wouldn't really solve anything. That piece of Voldemort would fly away like smoke and return in another body. Crucially, this would also destroy any chance of Harry returning to life after being killed by Voldemort in Book 7, because it would have destroyed the tether that Voldemort actually made by using Harry's blood in Book 4. Hopefully you're tracking all of this. It's a bit complicated. So, all that said, what spell did Dumbledore cast? With Dumbledore's goal in mind of finishing Voldemort for good, the only spell that makes sense to me is one that provides information about the remaining Horcruxes. Maybe that was the number of Horcruxes remaining, their locations, the form they were in, anything to get Dumbledore a step closer to ending Voldemort for good. Furthermore, because Voldemort is the second person to ever create a Horcrux and the first to make multiple, the spell is probably one of Dumbledore's own creation. Up until this point, there would have been no need for a spell that would locate another person's soul. And in all reality, magic that affects the soul is probably pretty unexplored territory, trekked solely by Dumbledore and Voldemort. So when Harry sees or feels this spell go past him, it's no wonder he doesn't have a name for it and doesn't really know what it does. From a meta perspective, that spell isn't for Harry, it's for us, the reader. You're supposed to draw more conclusions from it than Harry can. Harry's an idiot. You, dear viewer, are not. So the last thing that I think is interesting here is maybe Harry's the only one that would have reacted that way when the spell whizzed past him. Maybe because it's seeking out souls, Harry's having some sort of unique reaction to it because of the Horcrux status that he has. With that, we've reached the end of a long, long iceberg. If you watched this whole thing, wow, I'm eternally grateful. That's like 2.5 hours of Harry Potter content. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully you learned a few things, and at the very least, I hope you were entertained. If you watched this long, you're gonna like the other content I make, I promise, so go ahead and click the subscribe button. You won't regret it. More than anything else, the best way to help the channel is to watch another video. It tells YouTube my videos are worth showing to others, and it allows me to keep making more. So click one of those suggested videos and add it to your watch later maybe. I appreciate it. That's it for me. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you next time.